Hey everyone. Tonight we open a dossier on Dockside crew that kept working, kept smiling, and still slipped out of the record like a hand through fog. You probably won't want to believe. If you want more cases like this, hit like and subscribe. We follow the paper, not the gossip, and the paper never sleeps. Keep the lights low. You step into the archive the way you step onto a pier after midnight, slow, listening. The building is warm in the wrong places and cold in the right ones. A fan turns somewhere, pushing stale air in careful circles. Outside, rain taps a patient rhythm against a window you cannot quite find. On the desk sits a folder the color of old bone. No title, just the scab of torn tape and a faint rectangle where a label used to be. It smells like dust, ink, and reheated coffee. You open it anyway, because this is how a cold case begins in the real world. Not with sirens, with stationery. The silent rule that controlled this Dockside crew is not a myth. It is a mechanism. It is a way to turn a job into a favor, then turn the favor into a leash. It lives where nobody likes to look, in hiring, in assignments, in the quiet arithmetic between what a man earns and what he is told he earned. You slide out the first evidence object and set it under the desk lamp. It is one photocopied page, thin enough to show its own fibers when the light hits it. The corners curl like they are trying to escape. There is a coffee ring near the bottom left, perfect and humiliating. A staple hole at the top has torn into a crescent, a small paper wound that suggests something used to be attached and is not anymore. The toner is slightly raised, gritty under your fingertip, and the whole sheet carries that faint smell of hot plastic that comes from a printer that has done too much. The heading reads like an institution clearing its throat. An annual report, a mission, a reason for existing. Then the page reaches back into the early 1950s and describes the morning shape-up, the daily hiring scramble where hundreds of dock workers fought for tokens that meant a single shift, a single day of pay. It states plainly that only those who supported corrupt leaders and agreed to kick back part of their wages could count on a spot in a work gang. You sit with that sentence, and you feel the room change. Not colder, more honest. Because once you accept that work can be rationed, you start seeing how silence is sold. Here is the first system insight, and it is procedural, not poetic. Oversupply creates a choke point. When there are more bodies than jobs, the person or process that controls access becomes the market. The report describes how the shape-up let a hiring boss decide who worked and who starved. That decision was the power. The kickback was the price. Even when reforms arrive, the logic does not evaporate. It replicates. It moves from the public spectacle to the private schedule. It slides into overtime lists, into better assignments, into who gets called first when a ship comes in hot and the clock is bleeding money. Control becomes quieter, which makes it harder to prove and easier to live with. And that is how the silent rule keeps a crew in line without ever leaving a bruise. On the docks, the rule sounds like advice. Don't make trouble. Don't ask who decided. Don't question the numbers. Don't talk to outsiders. Those sentences do not need to be shouted. They travel by repetition. passed from foreman to gang, from older hand to new hire, until they feel like weather. The public record gives more pieces of the machine. It describes how no show and no work jobs can exist. Paid positions where someone collects without labor and still exerts influence. It describes how companies can be pressured to pay for services that are overpriced or not real at all. A kind of waterfront tax that hides inside invoices. You do not have to invent a villain for that. The system is already doing the work. Now you look back at the page on your desk and you see why this case belongs on midnight dossiers. The silent rule is not just fear. It is paperwork plus incentives. It is the way a legitimate process can be bent until it functions like a gate with a man behind it. You build a timeline in your head because the mind hates a vacuum. First, a hiring ritual that turns desperation into competition. Then, oversight designed to break the cycle. Then, the slow evolution into subtler forms of control, where nothing looks illegal until you compare enough documents long enough. You trace the coffee ring again. You note the missing attachment implied by the torn staple hole. I log the page as Exhibit A because it establishes the mechanism in the words of an official source, not a rumor passed down at the bar. And now the money trail begins, the only way it can begin in a case like this, with discrepancy. Not a suitcase of cash, a missing shift, an overtime slot that always lands on the same name. Buy stub that shows a deduction nobody can explain. A permit stamped at an odd hour. A record that is technically complete, except for the parts that feel strangely smooth, strangely cautious, as if the details were quietly redacted before anyone had to ask. You close the folder halfway, then stop. You leave it open under the lamp. In this room, hiding is part of the problem. Somewhere outside, a ship horn moans and fades. You imagine the crew moving in the dark, heads down, doing the work that keeps the world fed. You imagine how easy it is to control men who cannot afford to miss a day. You imagine how a silent rule can survive decades simply by changing its clothing. Tonight, you do not have a single name to speak. You do not have a confession to play. What you have is the first crack in the official story. A document that admits the choke point existed, and a present tense that suggests it never fully stopped mattering. You reach for the next tab in the dossier. It doesn't say crime. It doesn't say violence. It says something worse. It says assignment. The folder stays open like a mouth that refuses to swallow its own words. You don't rush. You've learned that in a cold case, the truth isn't hiding in the loud places. It's hiding in the quiet administrative corners, where people stop asking questions because the forms keep coming anyway. You pull the next evidence object from the dossier and lay it flat under the lamp. Put a carbon copy dispatch slip, the kind that's meant to be torn off fast with a thumb and stuffed into a pocket that smells like wet rope. The paper is thin, bluish, and slightly waxy, with perforations along the left edge, like a row of tiny bitten teeth. There, S, a smear of black ink near the top, where someone's hand must have been damp, and the smear trails downward, as if the page tried to escape while it was being signed. At the bottom, A signature sits in a hurry. Not a name you can prove belongs to anyone. Just the looping shorthand of authority. The ink presses hard enough to emboss the fibers. You can feel the grooves if you drag a fingernail across them. The slip carries a faint odor of diesel and something older, like salt that never quite dries. Near the center, one line is blocked out, not neatly, not the clean, bureaucratic black bar you see in official releases. Biss's marker, laid on, thick, shiny in the lamp's heat. It catches the light in ridges. Whoever did it wasn't thinking about record retention. They were thinking about being safe. That's how the silent rule introduces itself to you. Not with a threat, with an absence. The official story, the one you can always get on the phone from any office that still answers after hours, is simple. Too simple. A reduction in hours. A seasonal slowdown. Personnel changes. Records updated. Nothing unusual. Everyone accounted for. You've heard versions of it in 100 different cases. It's the foreman's script. It's the verbal equivalent of a stamped form. A sentence designed to end a conversation without sounding like it ended anything. You start building a timeline, because any system that lies has to lie in sequence. The dispatch slip gives you the date and shift designation, the kind of coded shorthand that means more to the payroll desk than it does to a man in steel-toe boots. It lists the vessel assignment in clipped language and the work category in a code that's supposed to be neutral. Neutral, like a locked door. Then you notice the first crack. The slip is numbered, but the numbering doesn't match the order it should. You flip it over. The back is blank except for a thumbprint in grime, a half-moon of dirt that says it was handled on the dock, not in an office. The corners are softened, rolled from being folded and unfolded. This was carried. This was lived with for a shift. I log the slip as Exhibit B and note the blacked-out line, because a redacted gap on a working document isn't a clerical flourish. It's an intervention. Now the money trail begins to show its teeth. Not in a suitcase, in a missing digit. You slide out the next page. And you feel the temperature in the room change, even though the air doesn't. It's a payroll Excel, photocopied, cropped, incomplete. The sort of thing someone prints when they trying to prove a point without letting you see the whole page. The toner is heavier here, darker, and the paper is thicker, as if it came from a different machine. There's a crease down the center, like it was folded into a wallet and carried close. Not because it was valuable, but because it was dangerous. The hours column shows a shift that should pay. The line exists. The date exists. The code exists. But the amount is blanked with the same kind of marker. The same glossy ridges catching the lamp. A deliberate silence in ink. You stare at it long enough to feel the old truth of dock work settle in your bones. The job is physical, but the control is administrative. Here's the system insight, concrete and procedural, the kind that doesn't care about your feelings. On most docks, the hours you work aren't real until they're acknowledged by the right signature, the right code, the right entry in the right system. Timekeeping is a chain. It runs from the gang to the foreman, from the foreman to a clerk, from the clerk to payroll. If the chain breaks at any link, The hours can become pending, under review, adjusted, or simply not found. And the correction process is never neutral. To fix a discrepancy, you don't just point at your sore hands. You file, you submit, you wait, you appeal. You speak to someone who knows someone. You walk into an office where the silent rule already lives in the walls. Be easy to manage, or become easy to erase. The paper does the threatening for them. A missing pay line can be explained a dozen ways on paper, and that's the beauty of it for anyone who benefits. It can be an error. It can be a system glitch. It can be a late submission. It can be a dispute. It can be awaiting verification. Each explanation is plausible, and the bureaucracy loves plausible because plausible doesn't require proof. But the marker on the page tells you something else. Someone didn't want you to know which explanation was used. You hold the payroll excerpt closer. You angle it under the light. Sometimes you can see ghosts through ink. Sometimes you can read pressure marks where a pen wrote on the page above. Here you catch a faint indentation near the redacted line, like a note was written and torn away. The paper remembers even when the file pretends it doesn't. You go back to the dispatch slip and you compare the codes. The shift designation should match the payroll category. It mostly does. Mostly. Then you see the mismatch that matters. The dispatch slip implies a full assignment, but the payroll excerpt treats it like something else, something conditional, something that can be denied without calling it denial. You picture the foreman delivering the script, not with malice, with routine. We'll straighten it out. Payroll's behind. Talk to the office, not my department. The phrase changes. The mechanism doesn't. You keep your conclusions constrained, because this is real dossier territory and the record is thin. So you lay out the plausible interpretations without pretending to know which one is true. 1. It really is an administrative error, and the marker is the worker's way of protecting their identity while showing proof of discrepancy. 2. It's a retaliatory adjustment, a procedural punishment that doesn't need a threat, only a delay. Control through inconvenience, discipline through paperwork. 3. It's part of a larger siphon where missing pay becomes leverage and leverage becomes compliance. The silent rule doesn't need to steal everything. It only needs to remind you it can. You breathe out slowly, and the room smells like toner and rain again. The blacked out lines bother you most because they point to a shadow you can't name yet. Not a man, a structure, a way of doing business where silence isn't demanded. It's incentivized, and incentives are always cleaner than intimidation. Intimidation leaves marks. Incentives leave spreadsheets. You stack the two documents neatly. Dispatch slip on top, payroll excerpt beneath, like a hierarchy, like a chain of command. You've got your first measurable crack in the official story, a shift that exists in one place and disappears in another, on a dock that's never just an accident. It's a message, even if you can't prove who wrote it. You close your hand around the edge of the folder, feeling the paper bite lightly into your skin. You don't need a confession yet. You need a witness who will talk about the rule without saying the rule. You don't find dockside truth in bright rooms. You find it where the air tastes like iron and salt, where a man can look you in the eye and still keep his mouth locked behind his teeth. You leave the archive with the folder's weight still in your hands, and the rain meets you like it's been waiting for your signature. The port is awake in fragments. A forklift beeps somewhere out in the dark, backing up like a bird that never learned a better song. A chain clinks. Water drips off corrugated metal in steady little insects. You keep the timeline in your head, and you keep your questions small. Big questions make people defensive. Small questions make them nostalgic. You find the witness where you expect to find him. Not at the dock gate, not at the Union Hall, but near a vending machine that sells coffee brave enough to be called hot. He doesn't look like a man with secrets. He looks like a man with routines. That's usually worse. His hands are the first thing you notice. Knuckles thick, nails short. Skin cracked in the places that only crack when you VA spent years gripping what docentee want to be gripped. Salt has lived on those hands so long, it's practically a second language. You speak to him like you're asking for directions. He answers like he's reciting. He gives you the foreman's script without using the foreman's words. Seasonal slowdown, miscommunication, clerical error, they'll fix it. He says it too quickly, in the same rhythm each time, as if the phrasing was handed to him with his dispatch slip. And when you ask about the missing pay line, his eyes don't go to your face. They go to the office building behind the fence. That's your first real movement in the money trail tonight. Not proof, not a confession, just direction. The quiet gravitational pull of where he thinks the decision lives. You don't press. You let silence do its work. Silence makes people fill gaps, or it makes them reveal where the gaps are being guarded. He swallows and shifts his weight. Look, he says, and there's the crackle of irritation underneath the practiced calm. You don't want your name attached to this. You don't want the paperwork. You don't want to be the guy who makes them pull files them. Not him, not the foreman, not payroll. Them, the system without a face, the shadow with a letterhead. You ask one more gentle question, and he flinches at the softness of it. What do you call it, you say, when everyone knows and nobody says it? His lips tighten. He looks past you at the wet asphalt. A truck rolls by and sprays the curb. For a second, he's just another man waiting out the weather. Then he gives you a half answer. Not the name, the shape. A rule, he says. A quiet one. He digs into his jacket pocket, hesitates like he's touching something sharp, and produces the evidence object like he's trying not to make it obvious. It's a small page torn from a pocket notebook, the kind made for people who don't have desks. The paper is stiff from getting wet and drying again. Salt crystals have formed along one edge, tiny white teeth you can feel with your thumb. The ink is smeared in places, but not enough to erase the meaning. A handful of codes, a sequence of times, a short list of numbers that look like extensions. The page smells like seawater and old tobacco, and there's a greasy fingerprint near the bottom that never really comes off. One corner is missing, torn away in panic, like someone ripped off the part that could identify the notebook it came from. You don't call it evidence out loud. You treat it like what it is in his world, a risk. I slide the page into a clear sleeve from my pocket, because wet paper is fragile, and so is courage when it's exposed to fluorescent officers. You read the scribbles slowly. The codes match the kind of shorthand you've already seen. Shift identifiers, a note about adjusted hours, and then, sitting there like it doesn't understand it's dangerous, a name that isn't a person, a vendor, a back-office service, a payroll processor, something administrative that doesn't sweat, doesn't lift, doesn't get yelled at by a ship's schedule. This is where the case stops being about one crew and starts being about a mechanism. Here's the system insight, and it's as boring as it is powerful. When a port outsources its administration, it also outsources its accountability. The dock can say, "We sent the hours." Payroll can say, "We processed what we received." The contractor can say, "We followed the data feed." Every link in the chain gets plausible deniability as a job benefit. If a worker disputes a check, the dispute becomes a ticket, a case number, a form with a deadline. Miss the deadline and it dies quietly. File it wrong and it returns to you like an insult stamped incomplete. The silent rule doesn't need to threaten you directly. It only needs to make the correction process exhausting enough that you stop asking. And if someone does ask, if someone files a grievance, if someone forces a review, the system has a clean procedural way to punish them without ever calling it punishment. Fewer good assignments, fewer calls, more errors that always seem to land on the same name. You watch the witness while you read, and you understand what he's really telling you with this page. He's telling you the control isn't just Dockside. It's clerical. It's upstream. It's an office with policies and phone trees and someone whose hands stay dry. You ask him where he got the page. He shakes his head too fast. Doesn't matter. That's a lie. It matters so much, it hurts. But in a working man's world, doesn't matter often means I can't survive the answer. You ask him if he ever saw anyone try to fight it. He pauses. The script stutters. A little humanity leaks through. One guy, he says, kept records, copies, dates, tried to match the timeline. He almost says the name, then bites it back. He stopped showing up. Not like that. He won't give you drama. He gives you ambiguity. Just stop. You keep your conclusions constrained, because you can prove what stopped means from a torn notebook page and a man with fear in his throat. So you name what you can, and you keep the rest in the open as uncertainty. One plausible interpretation is simple. The worker quit. Burnout. Better job. Family. Life happens, and the port never asks why. Another is procedural. He was squeezed out, not fired, not threatened, just starved of shifts until the math made the decision for him. A third is darker, but still within the bounds of reality. He stayed, but he learned the silent rule and decided the price of speaking was higher than the cost of losing a little money. The witness watches you like he's watching a forecast. He wants to know if you're going to make this bigger than he can live with. You fold the sleeved page carefully, and you don't reach for your phone. You, Dan T., want him thinking you rebuilding a case he'll have to testify in tomorrow. You ask one last question, quiet enough that it doesn't sound like a challenge. What happens if you say the rule out loud? He looks at the office building again, then back at the wet ground. You don't, he says. That's the rule. And just before he leaves, he adds something that tastes like confession. They don't need to scare you, he murmurs. They just need to make you tired. When he disappears into the rain, you're left holding a small piece of paper that should never have existed. And that's how you know it's real enough to matter. Not because it proves everything, because it points somewhere specific. A vendor, a back office, a chain of custody for hours. A place where redacted gaps can be created with a keystroke instead of a marker. You return to the archive with a sleeved page tucked inside the folder, and you feel the case tightening. The shadow isn't a man at the gate. It's a process with a phone extension. The archive welcomes you back the way a closed bar welcomes a drunk. No judgment, no comfort, just a door that opens if you push hard enough. Rain follows you in on your coat and turns the room's stale air into something metallic. You set the folder down. You don't slam it. You don't baby it. You lay it flat like a body you're not allowed to name. The evidence object is waiting in the next pocket, heavier than paper should feel. Not because of weight, because of what it implies. It's a ledger page, ripped from a bound book that once lived on a desk no worker ever saw. The paper is thick, cream-colored, and scored with faint blue lines that have faded like an old bruise. Along the left margin, the teeth are gone, a ragged strip where the page was torn free, leaving little paper fibers standing up like stubble. When you run your thumb along that edge, it catches, and the page resists, as if it remembers being held in place. There are stains you can't fake. A smear of dark grease near the middle that looks like a palm print. A salt tide line where water once soaked and dried. The corners are dogged and softened, handled too often to be ceremonial. It smells like cardboard ink and a faint chemical temps, the perfume of old offices that never open windows. At the top is a date stamped in purple. The stamp is slightly crooked, pressed with impatience. Beneath it, columns, load identifiers, container counts, work gang codes, signatures. The handwriting changes every few lines, as if the ledger passed through different hands, and each hand left a different kind of pressure behind. And then you see it, a sequence break, not a tear, not a coffee ring, a missing run of entries, a clean gap where the page should be filled. The lines are there, waiting, but the ink never came. It's not one empty row. It's a stretch long enough to hold a whole crew's worth of work, long enough to hold a night that someone wanted to slide out of the timeline without dragging a spotlight behind it. In the margin, someone tried to correct the story with administrative language. A small notation in tight print, a DJ per office. Then, right over that, a thick swipe of marker, glossy and layered, redacted, but not officially. This is where the system insight becomes unavoidable, because ledgers aren't romantic, they're procedural. They're how a port convinces itself it's honest. That chain creates the illusion of inevitability. If the container moved, it must have been recorded. If it was recorded, it must have been paid. If it was paid, it must have been legitimate. But the chain is only as real as its weakest checkpoint. If a foreman controls the initial reporting, the paper can be corrected before it ever becomes permanent. If the office controls the data entry, a gap can be created that looks like a clerical delay. If a third-party processor is in the loop, responsibility can be bounced like a bad check. Operations blames payroll. Payroll blames the vendor. The vendor blames the data provided, and the worker is left staring at a phone menu that never offers the option for truth. And here S, the detail that makes the silent rule sustainable. Most disputes have a time limit. Maybe the ledger was incomplete because the night was chaotic, and the entries were meant to be filled later. Maybe the page was damaged and someone copied the data elsewhere. Maybe the gap is the simplest truth. Negligence, not conspiracy. But then you look at the marker swipe over a DJ per office, and negligence starts to feel like a costume. Redacted isn't just a word here. It's a behavior. You run your finger along the ragged tear edge again, those missing teeth. And you realize something else. This page didn't fall out. It was pulled. Someone wanted it separated from the book, made portable, controllable, deniable. A loose page can be misplaced. A bound book is harder to lose without anyone noticing. You stack the evidence in a neat, quiet pile. Dispatch slip, payroll excerpt, torn notebook page. Ledger sheet with its deliberate blankness. A small tower of paper that tells a bigger story than any witness can afford to tell. The shadow in this case isn't a man in a door. It's a gap in an official record that still expects you to believe it's whole. You close the folder just enough to hear the paper breathe, then open it again. You leave it open because you know what comes next. If the ledger page is missing its middle, the missing middle has to be somewhere. And whoever holds it is the one enforcing the silent rule. Not with threats, but with control of the timeline. The Union Hall doesn't announce itself. It just sits there, brick and fluorescent hum, like a place that learned long ago it can outlast your questions. You arrive before dawn, but after hope. The parking lot is a shallow mirror of rainwater, reflecting a sign that looks tired of being read. Inside, the air is warmer than it should be, thick with old coffee and damp wood. A bulletin board sags under layers of paper, some new, some sun-faded, some pinned so many times the cork looks wounded. You keep your voice low, even though nobody told you to. Buildings like this train. A man at the front desk watches you with the practiced indifference of someone who has seen every kind of problem and learned that most of them aren't his. You don't ask for names. You ask for procedure. That's how you get past gatekeepers. You speak the language of forms. He points you down a hallway lined with framed photos that never include the people who got hurt. You pass a door marked grievance, another marked membership, another marked safety. Words that promise justice, the way weather reports promise sunshine. You stop at a metal filing cabinet that looks like it has swallowed 1,000 arguments. The top drawer is dented near the handle, like someone once yanked too hard. A strip of masking tape labels the drawer in shaky handwriting. The tape is peeling at the corners, clinging on out of habit, and that's where you find it. Not in a folder, not in a file. tucked behind a row of hanging folders like an afterthought that didn't want to be discovered. The evidence object, a sealed envelope, thick and stiff, the kind used for documents that shouldn't be folded. The paper is manila, but darker than the folder in your archive, as if it's been marinating in years. Along the flap, a strip of glue has browned with age. It's still sealed, but the seal is tired, ready to give up if you apply the right pressure. There's a stamp on the back, partially smudged, not a government stamp, something internal. A circular mark with a date that's hard to read, ink bled by moisture and time. The edges are frayed where the envelope rubbed against other paper for weeks, maybe months, maybe longer. Put across the front, someone wrote in block letters with a pen that pressed too hard for review. Under that, a number sequence that looks like it could be an internal case ID, except it's missing a digit, like the writer hesitated at the last second and chose silence instead. You lift it and feel the weight shift inside. Contents plural. The envelope makes a soft, dry rattle when you tilt it, like thin sheets sliding against each other. It smells like paper and sweat and a little bit of cheap cologne. The scent of a room where men try to look confident while begging for hours. I log the envelope as Exhibit D and note the smudged stamp, because the first question in a place like this isn't what's inside. It's who touched it and when. You don't tear it open yet. You set it on the desk in the Union Hall's small side office. The kind with a single chair and a desk that has heard too much. You run your thumb along the flap. The glue line resists, then yields with a quiet sigh. A sound so small it feels like you're doing something wrong. Inside are 3 sheets. The first is a photocopy of a shift assignment list. Names are partially obscured, not fully blacked out. More like someone tried to protect people while still proving a point. The ink is uneven, some parts sharp, some parts washed out, suggesting it was copied from a copy, generation like a rumor that became a document. The second sheet is a grievance form, not filled out fully. Some fields are blank, some are scribbled fast. The handwriting shifts halfway through, as if 2 people took turns holding the pen, or one person's courage ran out and another person's anger took over. The third sheet is the one that makes the room go quieter. It's a handwritten accounting note, a crude ledger of numbers that shouldn't exist on union paper. A list of dates, a list of hours, and beside them small deductions that don't match any standard dues structure. The math is tight, careful, practiced. The totals are circled twice, like someone needed to convince themselves the sum was real. This is the money trail, but it doesn't look like a crime movie. It looks like life shaved down into petty arithmetic. And there's a line at the bottom, underlined so hard the paper is scarred. Do not discuss, not a threat, a directive, an instruction designed to survive in daylight. You sit with the 3 sheets spread out like a confession that refuses to speak. The shift list suggests certain people consistently receive better assignments. The grievance form suggests someone tried to contest an adjustment and got lost in process. The handwritten numbers suggest money moving in a way that never appears on official paperwork. Small enough to be plausible, consistent enough to be intentional. Then the contradictions begin, because this is the fog. and fog is where stories lose their sharp edges. The shift list date matches the dispatch slip from your archive, but the crew code differs by one character. A clerical error, if you're generous. A deliberate misclassification, if you're awake. The grievance form references a correction request, but the section for resolution is blank. No signature, no closeout date, no official stamp. Just emptiness where a system is supposed to leave footprints. And on the handwritten accounting note, one line has been scribbled over hard enough to tear the paper fibers. Not fully blacked out, not cleanly redacted, just violently obscured. You can't read it, but you can feel the pressure that erased it. Whoever did that wasn't hiding a typo. They were hiding a relationship. Here's the system insight, and it's the part that makes your stomach tighten because it's mundane. A union hall can be a shield or a choke point, depending on how its procedures are managed. Assignment lists, seniority rules, overtime rotation, grievance timelines, committees. These are supposed to protect workers by turning fairness into policy. But policy can also be used as camouflage. If an assignment system is just complex enough, small manipulations can hide in plain sight. A code change here, a clerical correction there, a missed deadline on a grievance because the right form was unavailable that day. A worker told to resubmit, then told the resubmission window has closed. A dispute not denied, just delayed until it dies of exhaustion. And when the process is the weapon, nobody needs to threaten you directly. The silent rule becomes, don't force us to use the process against you. You look again at the grievance form. The date field is filled, but the time is missing. The section for witness is blank. The contact number is written, then crossed out, then rewritten with different digits. It reads like someone panicked while filling it out, as if even writing the truth felt like stepping into a spotlight. You remember the witness at the vending machine. They don't need to scare you, he said. They just need to make you tired. In your hands, the papers prove he wasn't being poetic. You don't have enough to accuse anyone, and you don't pretend you do. You treat the documents like what they are, signals, a pattern trying to become visible. So you hold the plausible interpretations in your palm like coins. 1. The handwritten deductions are legitimate. Informal reimbursements or dues adjustments, recorded privately because someone didn't trust the official system. 2. The deductions are a quiet skim. A tax on desperation disguised as normal, spread thin enough that no single man can afford to be the one who screams. 3. The numbers are leverage, not profit. A way to keep everyone slightly compromised, slightly afraid, because compromise is the strongest lock a shadow can use. You slide the 3 sheets back into the envelope, but you don't reseal it. The seal is broken now, and so is the idea that this is just a payroll mistake. You take one last look at the words for review on the front, and you understand what's really being reviewed. Not the paperwork, the person holding it. You leave the union hall with the envelope hidden inside your coat, pressed against your ribs like a second heartbeat. Outside, the rain has eased into a fine mist that makes the streetlights look guilty. Back in the archive, you lay the envelope on top of the ledger page. It fits too well, like these things have been waiting to be stacked. The case is no longer just a discrepancy. It's a system rehearsing its own innocence. And somewhere inside that system, the silent rule is about to be named. The envelope sits on the desk like it resents being opened. You keep it in front of you anyway, because the more a system insists on quiet, the more you learn by refusing to whisper. You spread the papers from the Union Hall out in a careful fan. Shift list, grievance form. The handwritten deductions that look too consistent to be accidental. You stare at the dates until they stop being numbers and start becoming a timeline. And then you notice what isn't there. There's no threat on any of it. No or else. No warning scribbled in the margins. No profanity. No violence. No theatrical intimidation. Just blanks. Just missing resolution fields. Just codes that don't match across documents by a single character. Small enough to dismiss. Precise enough to weaponize. That's the pivot right there. The silent rule isn't enforced by fear or fist. It's enforced by eligibility. New, pull the next evidence object from the dossier and let it thud softly onto the desk, heavier than it looks. It's a printed packet titled in plain, dead font, dispatch and overtime rotation procedures. 2 pages, stapled at the top left. The staple is rusting. The paper around it has gone soft and brown, as if the metal has been slowly bleeding into the fibers for years. But pages are slightly glossy, like they were printed on office stock, meant to feel official, durable enough to survive being passed hand to hand. There's a coffee stain in the upper margin, a splash shaped like a bruise. Someone highlighted several lines in yellow, but the ink has faded to a sickly pastel. Like the document has been reread so many times, the emphasis wore out. The corners are dogged. The bottom edge has a faint ripple where it once got wet and dried too fast. The language is clean, almost comforting. It says overtime is rotated fairly. It says assignments are distributed according to procedure. It says disputes can be raised through a defined process. It uses words like equitable and transparent, the way a locked gate uses polished metal. Then you find the sentence that changes everything. A clause that looks harmless until you understand how systems eat people. It reads, in some version of formal calm, eligibility for dispatch and overtime is subject to operational needs, verified availability, and compliance with reporting requirements. It's a simple line. It's also a trapdoor, because the silent rule isn't do what we say. The silent rule is stay eligible. That single idea turns control into policy. It means you can punish someone without ever punishing. You can starve them of shifts while insisting you never touched their paycheck. You can keep your hands clean while the outcome gets ugly. And the mechanism is so procedural, it barely feels like cruelty. Here's the system insight, concrete enough to sting. In a dispatch system, the most powerful word is not no. It's not available. Availability is supposed to be neutral. A worker shows up, checks in, confirms they can work. But availability is also a field in a system, a code, a checkbox, a status. And status can be changed quietly, justified with paperwork that looks legitimate from a distance. If your availability is questioned, you can be held pending verification. If you miss a call, you can be marked non-responsive. If your reporting is deemed incomplete, Your status becomes inactive until corrected. Every one of those labels sounds like administration. Each one functions like a collar. The document describes a dispute path. Of course it does, but the dispute path is timed, layered, conditional. Submit within a window. Use the correct form. Attach the correct evidence. Await review. Request escalation. Await review again. Bureaucracy doesn't need to win arguments. It only needs to win the calendar. That's how the silent rule becomes a lifestyle. The crew learns that being difficult is expensive, because difficult gets translated into the language of the system. Difficult requires additional verification. Difficult becomes pending review. Difficult becomes not eligible for priority dispatch. You stare at the highlighted clause until you can almost see the hands that highlighted it. Not an angry person, a tired person. Someone who read the policy and finally understood they weren't being threatened. They were being processed. I mark the clause with a small pencil line in the margin, because ink feels too permanent for a system that survives by pretending nothing is permanent. Now the earlier evidence rearranges itself in your mind. The ledger gap isn't just missing ink. It's a status change in the chain of record. The grievance form isn't just unfinished. It's a person forced into a process that eats time. The mismatch in crew code isn't just sloppy. It's the kind of tiny discrepancy that can justify a correction, which can justify a delay, which can justify a different outcome. And those handwritten deductions, the little private arithmetic, stop looking like a separate story. They start looking like a coping mechanism. A quiet internal economy that forms when the official economy keeps turning you into a question mark. The pivot changes what you're even investigating. You thought you were looking for the enforcer of the silent rule, a foreman, a fixer, a hard voice in the dark. But the enforcer is a form field. The shadow isn't standing at the gate. It's sitting inside the procedure, wearing the mask of neutrality. You go back to the grievance form from the envelope, and you read it with the clause in mind. The missing resolution section isn't an oversight. It's the point. Without resolution, nothing formally happened. Without a closed case, no one is forced to admit anything. The worker stays in limbo, and limbo is where eligibility quietly dies. You keep yourself honest, and you keep your conclusions constrained, because public facts rarely arrive with a neat bow. So you lay out the plausible interpretations like evidence tags. 1. The clause is standard, and the failures you're seeing are normal bureaucratic friction. Nobody intended harm. The system is just slow, and the dock is just messy. 2. The clause is exploited selectively. It creates enough discretion that assignments and pay corrections can be steered without leaving fingerprints. Not always. Only when someone needs to be reminded. 3. The clause is the silent rule by design, a policy built to look fair, while giving certain actors a lever. The lever doesn't need to move often. It only needs to exist, so everyone behaves as if it will. You look at the clock and feel the night thinning. The way fog thins when morning is still too far away to call itself hope. The case feels clearer now, and that clarity is its own kind of dread. Because if the silent rule is embedded in procedure, then exposing it isn't about catching a villain. It's about proving intent inside a system built to deny it. You close the packet and set it on top of the other papers, like a verdict that hasn't been read yet. The desk lamp hums softly. The rain outside keeps writing its own testimony against the glass. Your next move isn't to find a man. Your next move is to find the office that stamps verified, and the port authority chain that treats a stamp like truth. You follow the timeline forward. You go where the paper learns how to erase. Port authority, building the way you find a bruise under a sleeve. You weren't looking for it at first. Then, suddenly, it's all you can see. The lobby is fluorescent and indifferent. Tile floors that reflect the rain you tracked in. A security desk behind scuffed plexiglass. Posters about safety that read like prayers for people who are already in trouble. The clock on the wall ticks too loud, like it's trying to keep the timeline honest by force. You tell the guard you're here for records. You don't say truth. You don't say missing crew. You say permit verification, because systems respond to their own language, the way doors respond to the right key. He points you to a counter with a bell that has been rung by too many tired hands. A clerk appears behind the glass, eyes half-lit, mouth set in a neutral shape of procedure. You slide the docket number across, not a name, a number. You've learned that if a cold case has a pulse, it's usually coded. She disappears without drama, returns with a file that looks like it's been handled just enough to be dangerous. The evidence object lands in front of you like a quiet sentence. It's a stamped permit packet, bound with a brass fastener that's gone dull and green at the edges to punch holes. A red string tie that someone cut and retied too many times, leaving fuzzy fibers like frayed nerves. The cover page is a pale gray cardstock, slightly gritty, the kind that collects fingerprint oil and never lets go. There's a stamp on the front, purple ink pressed so hard it bled into the next layer of paper. The stamp reads authorized, and beneath it, a date that matches your ledger gap. The ink smells faintly chemical, the way fresh bureaucracy always does. The lower corner is dog-eared, bent back and flattened again, as if someone kept opening it to the same page. Inside, the paper shifts with a dry rasp. Some pages are thin and crisp, some are thicker and older, like they've been grafted in from other files. A few are water-warped at the edges, the fibers raised where rain once tried to dissolve the story. Halfway through, you hit it, a page titled Incident Summary. Most of the lines are filled in: time, location, category. A few checkboxes, then where the narrative should be. There's a block of black marker laid down in impatient strokes. Not clean, not printed, not official in the way it pretends to be. Redacted, but done by a human hand that didn't want you to see what the paper was about to admit. The clerk watches your eyes like she's watching a weather report. You keep your face calm. Your hands don't shake. You turn the page carefully, as if the packet might accuse you if you move too fast. There's an attached corrective action form, and that's where the system reveals its teeth without showing blood. The form lists steps taken, review completed, supervisor notified, status updated, file closed. Each step has a box checked and a line for initials. The initials are there. The handwriting is neat, consistent, almost proud. The silent rule docentee need to threaten a Dockside crew when it can make their disappearance look compliant. Here's the system inside, concrete enough to feel like a lock clicking shut. Port Authority oversight is built around classification. If something happens on the docks, the first fight isn't about what happened. It's about what category it gets placed in. Safety incident triggers one path. Payroll dispute triggers another. Operational delay triggers another. Personnel matter triggers the quietest path of all. Once a category is chosen, procedure takes over. Procedure creates a trail of boxes that can be checked, deadlines that can be met, and outcomes that can be recorded without ever describing the lived truth. A file can be resolved in the system while the real event remains unresolved in the world. And the most powerful tool in that machine is the status. Update, eligibility, availability, clearance, access. These are not feelings. They are fields. A person can be moved from active to inactive without anyone raising their voice. A crew can be reassigned without anyone admitting they were punished. An incident can be addressed without anyone writing down the part that would cause trouble. You flip back to the permit cover page. The stamp date matches the ledger's empty stretch. Your timeline tightens. You compare the time listed on the permit packet with the shift code on your dispatch slip. Close enough to rhyme, not close enough to relax. You turn to the back of the packet and find a log page, the kind used for gate access. Names, badge numbers, entry times, and then a line where a name should be blank, not erased, not crossed out, just left empty, as if the paper itself refused to testify. You don't say anything. You just tap the blank line with your fingertip once, gently, like you're knocking on a door. The clerk clears her throat. Sometimes she says it's a scanner issue. Sometimes, always the word that lets a system breathe without admitting it's choking. You keep it procedural. How is it corrected? She shrugs in the small way people shrug when they want to stay employed. Supervisor submits a change request. A change request. Another form. Another controlled path. That's when the shadow in this place becomes visible. Not as a person, as a chain. Supervisor to office. Office to vendor. Vendor to payroll. Payroll to eligibility. Eligibility back to dispatch. A loop that can tighten around a crew without ever looking like a fist. I note the blank log entry and the redacted narrative block as the 2 points of friction. Because friction is where the machine is touching something real. You ask for the change request, the one that would fill the blank. The clerk gives you a look that says you asked for the ocean in a paper cup. That's internal, she says. Not released, not released. Like it's a product. Like truth has a distribution schedule. You ask, instead, for the policy that governs internal changes. You can always get policy. Policy is how systems brag. She slides a one-page printout under the glass. It's bland, but you read between the lines the way you read a doc at night. It says changes must be documented. It says approvals must be recorded. It says records are retained. It says access is restricted. It doesn't say who gets to decide when a change is justified. That's where discretion lives. Discretion is the quiet cousin of power. You return to the permit packet and look again at the checked boxes on the corrective action form. The initials repeat across multiple steps. One hand closing multiple doors. One person or one role functioning like a funnel. You can't name them yet. You can't accuse. But you can feel the system's shape now. And you can feel how it keeps the silent rule alive. A crew doesn't have to be threatened if the paperwork can make them non-compliant. A worker doesn't have to be fired if the status update can make them unavailable. A dispute doesn't have to be denied if it can be delayed until it expires. Outside the building, a truck downshifts, and the sound drags across the wet street like a confession you can't quite catch. You close the permit packet slowly, careful not to disturb the order of the pages. You leave the clerk with her glass and her neutral face. You step back into the rain with the files smell on your hands. Ink, metal fastener, the faint sweetness of old paper that's been trapped too long. Back at your desk, you lay the permit packet on top of the union envelope. Authorization over review. A stamp over a plea. The money trail isn't just cash moving. It's responsibility moving. It's liability moving. It's a system learning how to shift weight until the worker carries it all. And now you know the next question that matters. Not who did it, who insured it. You don't go looking for insurance. Insurance finds you the moment a system needs its story to sound accidental. By the time you reach the claims office, the rain has thinned into a damp haze that clings to your sleeves and makes the streetlights smear into long, tired halos. The building is the color of compliance. Glass, brushed metal, carpet designed to swallow footsteps. A place that smells like printer toner and polite denial. You sign in with the same careful handwriting you'd use on a confession. A receptionist hands you a badge that says "Visitor" in bold letters, as if the building needs to remind itself you're temporary. You're led to a small room with a table to clean to be trusted. A water pitcher no one drinks from. A box of tissues that feels like an insult before anything has even happened. Then the file arrives. The evidence object isn't dramatic. It doesn't need to be. It's thick enough to imply a lot of meetings. A claim folder, dark green. The kind with a clasp that snaps shut like a jaw. The corners are rounded from handling. The spine is cracked, showing white stress lines in the material like old knuckles. On the front, there, S, a printed label with a claim number, and a date that matches your timeline in a way that makes your skin go slightly cold. Inside, the pages are arranged with the obsessive neatness of people who believe order can substitute for morality. The first sheet is the incident report. You've already seen echoes of time, location, category. The narrative section is present, but most of it is blocked with clean black rectangles. Not marker this time. Professional redacted. The kind that wants you to feel like the censorship is responsible. The second sheet is an adjuster's note, printed on letterhead so bland it could be a confession. The paper is thin, almost crisp, but the corners are soft from being pulled out and pushed back in. There's a faint coffee stain on the bottom margin, and the ink smells fresh, like it was printed last week to make an older decision look current. The third sheet is where the story stops pretending. A settlement worksheet. Columns, figures, reserves, exposure, classification, recommended, disposition. Words that turn human consequences into manageable risk. The numbers are circled in pen, twice, with a pressure so heavy the page has dents you can feel. And beside the circled number is a note in a different hand, written fast, as if the writer didn't want their own thoughts to linger. Prefer administrative resolution. Avoid escalatory category. You turn the page slowly, not because you're savoring it, but because you can feel the shadow behind it. The shadow that doesn't want cops, doesn't want headlines, dosing tea, want anyone asking why a Dockside crew started slipping out of the record on the same night the ledger developed missing teeth. I logged the claim folder as Exhibit F, because the language inside it is the first time the system admits, in its own private dialect, that categories are choices. Here's the system insight, procedural and merciless. Insurance doesn't just pay, it narrates. A claim must fit a box. Accident, injury, property damage, operational incident. Each box triggers a different workflow, different reporting requirements, different regulators, different legal exposure. A system that wants to stay clean will steer events toward the category that creates the least scrutiny. Accident is easy. It's processed. It's priced. It's closed. Crime is radioactive. It invites law enforcement, subpoenas, public records. It creates uncontrollable witnesses, a timeline that can't be edited by a clerk with a stamp. So if a port can frame a disruptive night as an operational incident, it doesn't have to deny anything. It only has to manage the paperwork until the truth becomes inconvenient to retrieve. The adjuster's notes describe lack of corroborating documentation, and you almost laugh. But the sound stays trapped in your throat. Lack of documentation is often the point. If the gate log has a blank, if the ledger has a gap, if the grievance has no resolution, then the claim file can treat the whole matter as unverified. Unverified becomes dismissible. Dismissible becomes closed. Closed becomes history. And history becomes your cold case. You follow the money trail through the settlement worksheet, because money never lies. It only changes costumes. You see the reserves set early, then adjusted downward later, as if someone decided the risk was smaller than expected, or as if someone decided the narrative was under control. There's a line for lost time, and it's minimal, almost insulting. There's a line for administrative costs, and it's higher than it should be, padded with consultant language. Third, party review, compliance services, operational audit. Those are the words used when the system pays itself to explain itself. Then you find the attachment that makes the whole room feel smaller. A scanned copy of a check. Not a big check, not cinematic. A modest amount printed in perfect machine font, payable to a name that isn't a worker and isn't a union. It's payable to a service entity, a consulting firm, a risk management partner, a company whose job is to keep certain kinds of problems from becoming visible problems. The signature is a printed facsimile, the kind that lets a person avoid the physical act of signing their name to consequences. The check copy has a faint crease through the middle, suggesting it was folded, shown, carried, then flattened again to become just a record. It smells faintly of copier toner, like every other denial in this building. You lay the check copy beside the settlement worksheet. You don't need to be a poet to understand what you're seeing. The system paid to keep the category quiet. That's the handshake, not between people in an alley, between departments on paper. And now you understand why the Dockside crew doesn't get threatened. Because the system doesn't need to threaten people who don't control categories. It only needs to control the reporting requirements that decide what is real. You read the redacted incident narrative again, looking for edges for the shape of what's missing. There's a mention of unauthorized access, blacked out after 2 words. There's a mention of employee status, blacked out entirely. There's a mention of corrective action, kept visible, because corrective action sounds responsible. You keep your conclusions constrained, because even with this file, you're still looking at an engineered view of reality. So you hold the plausible interpretations like a set of keys, testing which one fits the lock. 1. This is a normal claim file doing normal things. The redacted sections protect privacy and reduce liability, not truth. The consulting payment is routine, the kind of compliance expense large operations swallow without thinking. 2. The file was shaped to keep the event inside a low scrutiny category, using redactions and classification language to steer attention away from the crew's disappearance from the record. Not necessarily because of a conspiracy, but because bureaucracies always prefer problems they can close. 3. The system deliberately created documentation gaps, then used those gaps to declare the event unverified, allowing a quiet settlement and a quiet status update that made certain workers quietly ineligible. A shadow made of policies, not threats. Your hands hover over the pages like you're afraid they'll stain you. You can feel the tug-of-war between what the file says and what it avoids saying. This is where the Neuer part of your brain wants a villain. But the file keeps offering you something colder, a workflow, a set of incentives, a culture that treats silence as a form of risk management. You slide the claim folder closed, and the clasp snaps with a sharp little click that sounds too much like a lock. You stand to leave, and you notice something on the inside cover you didn't TC before, a routing slip with initials, dates, and departments. One set of initials repeats, the same hand moving the file along, the same hand confirming it was reviewed, the same hand deciding the narrative would remain redacted, the same hand making the timeline behave. You don't have a name you can prove. You don't have a confession, but you have the shape of the system now. And it's ugly because it's ordinary. Outside, dawn is still a rumor. The rain has stopped pretending to fall and started pretending it never did. You walk back to your desk with the claim folders smell on you. That mix of paper and disinfectant that always makes truth feel like something being cleaned up. You set the file beside the ledger page and the union envelope, and for a moment you can see the whole machine at once. Dispatch, eligibility, port authority, stamps, grievances that die of paperwork, and insurance that pays to keep everything categorized as manageable. Manageable. That's the word that makes a human life small enough to move without anyone noticing. You turn off the desk lamp for a beat, just to see how the darkness rearranges the evidence. In the dim, the stack looks like a single object, a single story, a single shadow. Then you turn the lamp back on, because there's one thing left that categories can't fully control. A voice, a recording, something that happened on the dock before the paperwork had time to learn how to lie. The cassette finds you the way the worst truths do, through a side door. After hours, when nobody wants their name on the receipt, you read back in the archive with the claim folder still breathing its disinfectant smell into the room. The paperwork is stacked, clean and cruel. Permits, procedures, a grievance that never got its ending. A settlement worksheet that turns a night into a number. The money trail is everywhere, but it keeps wearing gloves. You need something that doesn't. You start with the smallest question that still bites. What did anyone say before the system had time to rewrite the timeline? A retired clerk, a former dispatcher, a guy who used to fix radios on tugboats, a woman who ran the late shift coffee stand for 20 years. You don't ask them to testify. You ask them if they remember the sound of that week. You let them talk around it. You listen for the tremor when a story hits the part that was redacted out of their memory by necessity. Someone finally says, there was a tape. Not a file, not a report, not a formal complaint. A tape. You meet a handoff in a parking lot that smells like wet asphalt and stale cigarettes. No names exchanged, no long looks, just a quick transfer that feels like passing a fever. When you get back to your desk, you set it under the lamp like it might crawl away. The evidence object is a cassette tape, the kind that used to hold music and now holds consequences. The plastic shell is scuffed and cloudy, worn down to a dull gray by years of pockets and friction. One corner is cracked, spiderwebbed from an impact. A strip of masking tape is stuck across the top where the original label used to be, but the tape is blank. Or maybe it was written on and then rubbed until it surrendered. The spools inside are visible through the cloudy window, and the tape itself looks slightly wrinkled, as if it was once exposed to heat, then cooled into a permanent nervousness. It smells faintly of seawater and machine oil, the dock's perfume. When you hold it close, you can hear a soft grit inside, like sand found a way into the mechanism. The metal screws are flecked with rust, not the kind of rust that comes from a drawer, the kind that comes from weather. You turn it over and find a small gouge in the plastic, a crescent-shaped bite. Something sharp hit it once, maybe a key, maybe a nail, maybe a moment of panic. You don't have chain of custody paperwork. You don't have an official provenance that would satisfy a courtroom. This is a cold case, not a trial, and the system loves that difference. It means the system can always say, later, that you were listening to ghosts. I log the cassette as Exhibit G anyway, because even a questionable object can illuminate a mechanism when the mechanism is the real subject. You find an old tape player in the archive cabinet, the kind with a worn rubber belt and a slightly loose door. It takes a couple tries to close. Everything in this case requires repetition. You press play. At first, there's only hiss, the ocean sound of magnetic dust and age. Then a click, a bump, the faint metallic groan of machinery in the background. A forklift alarm, a chain, a voice far away yelling something you can't make out. The dock, alive in fragments. Then the voices come in, two of them close to the mic, one of them further back. They're not yelling. That's what makes it worse. It's not a fight, it's instruction. You hear a man laugh once, short and dry, like he's trying to drain tension out of the air. Someone says, "It's not personal," and the phrase lands like a tool being set down. Another voice says, "If you file it, you're gonna get marked." That's just how it works. Marked, not threatened, categorized. Pause. A truck passes. The tape warps for a second, the sound bending like heat over asphalt. Then the closest voice again, lower now. You want good cause. You stay eligible. Eligible. The word from the procedures packet, spoken out loud on a dock in the rain. Suddenly, the policy isn't neutral anymore. It has a mouth. The third voice, further away, says something about the office. Something about a code. Something about availability. The tape hisses and swallows parts of it, but you catch the rhythm. The language of a system being explained to someone who still believed hard work was the only requirement. And then, like the tape decides to be generous for 1 second, you hear the sentence that makes your throat tighten. Don't make me put you on the slow list. Slow list. Not a punch, not a firing, a throttling. The dock keeps humming behind the voices. The world keeps moving. The shadow doesn't need to stop the work. It only needs to decide who benefits from it. Pews stop the tape and sit in the quiet that follows. It feels like the room is holding its breath with you. Here's the system insight, procedural enough to explain why a recording like this can exist and still change nothing. Systems don't fight inconvenient evidence head-on. They drown it in requirements. If you bring in a recording, the first response isn't "that didn't happen." It's "we can't authenticate." They ask who made it when it was made, how it was stored, whether it was edited. They ask for the original device. They ask for a check. They ask for a policy violation if recording wasn't permitted. Then they reframe the entire conversation. Not what does it reveal, but was it obtained properly? And the minute they make the debate about procedure, the truth becomes optional. They also isolate the recording from the workflow. An audio clip doesn't automatically alter a payroll entry. It doesn't automatically fill a blank gate log line. It doesn't automatically reopen a claim file that has already been categorized and closed. The machine continues unless the machine is forced to stop, and forcing it to stop usually requires the exact thing the silent rule is designed to prevent. A worker putting their name on a complaint and staying alive long enough inside the system to see it through. You rewind and listen again, slower. You're careful not to pretend you hear what isn't there. You admit the uncertainty like it's part of the evidence. The tape doesn't clearly identify who speaks. It doesn't mention a specific crew name. It doesn't say the port's name. It could be any dock, any shift, any era where access to work is a lever. So you hold the plausible interpretations in open hands. 1. This is an authentic snapshot of dock culture, a real explanation of how eligibility and assignments function informally. It doesn't prove a crime. It proves a mechanism, and mechanisms are often the real story. 2. It's authentic but contextless, a conversation about standard dispatch practices that sounds sinister only because you're re-listening through a case shaped by redactions and missing lines. 3. It's misattributed or incomplete, a fragment that got attached to this dossier because it fits the pattern, not because it belongs. The system would love this interpretation. It's the one that lets them call everything unverified and go back to sleep. But even in the most conservative interpretation, the tape does something the paperwork refuses to do. It admits the rule exists in spoken form. You don't need it to be a smoking gun. You need it to be a match in a room full of gas. Mute it to make the listener understand that the shadow here isn't a rumor. It's an operating principle. You set the cassette beside the procedures packet and feel how they mirror each other. Policy, language, and dock language, describing the same lever. The timeline tightens. The ledger gap stops being mysterious and starts being functional. The grievances, missing resolution stops being negligence and starts being a feature. You press play one more time and listen to the hiss like it's weather. In the background, you catch a faint sentence you didn't catch before. It's half swallowed, but it lands. Office already knows. Office already knows. The phrase doesn't accuse. It implies. It tells you the control isn't local. It's rooted. It's institutional. It's safer that way. You eject the tape, and the plastic door pops open like a small release of pressure. You hold the cassette in your palm and feel the cracked corner catch your skin. This is the psychological cost of the truth. It doesn't arrive as justice. It arrives as clarity. You can see the whole machine now, and the machine doesn't care who you are. It cares whether you're eligible. Outside, the rain starts again, lighter, like the night wants to pretend it never stopped. You look at your evidence stack, and you realize the final section won't be a chase. It will be a synthesis, a naming, and a decision about what remains in the dark. Because not every shadow can be dragged into the light without taking something with it. Dawn doesn't arrive so much as it leaks into the room, diluted and reluctant, the way truth does when a system has spent years learning how to keep it out. You sit with the dossier opened flat, pages breathing under the lamp. The pieces don't scream. They allow. A cold case doesn't close with drama. It closes when the paperwork finally admits what the people already knew. You rebuild the sequence one last time, slower than you want to. Dispatch, slip, ledger gap, permit, stamp, claim categorization, a grievance that never gets signed into existence. You don't need a new clue. You need the lever. Then you pull the last evidence object from the deepest pocket of the file. It's a triplicate status change request form. printed on carbon paper that stains your fingertips with bureaucracy. 3 layers, pale yellow, then pink, then white. The perforated edge is torn ragged, not clean, leaving a fringe of fibers like stubble. It smells faintly sweet and chemical, mixed with the older smell of storage, dust, damp, a hint of metal. Across the top, the heading tries to sound harmless. Availability update. Beneath it, boxes and codes. Most names are blocked out with careful rectangles, professionally redacted, as if the file learned manners. But the procedural heart remains visible. There's a date and time stamp that matches your ledger gap within minutes. There's a reason code, NR, with a printed legend in the margin. Non-responsive. There's a checkbox marked inactive, struck through once, then checked again with a harder pen, ink digging into the fibers like someone needed certainty. And on the approval line, initials repeat in neat, disciplined handwriting. The same 2 letters you've seen travel between departments, like a quiet passport. The form is creased down the center, folded and unfolded until the fold went soft. Someone carried this. Someone needed it close. You set it under the lamp and let it sit there like a verdict that refuses to be read aloud. Here is what you can say honestly, without inventing a villain where a workflow will do. A crew can vanish from the official record without vanishing from the dock. It happens when the system changes status first, then lets the documentation catch up. Mark a worker non-responsive, flip them inactive, and their eligibility for dispatch evaporates without a single raised voice. Once that switch flips, everything downstream gets to sound clean. Payroll can call a missing check an adjustment because ours are unverified operations. Can explain a ledger gap as a clerical correction because the crew is inactive. Port. Authority can route an incident into an administrative category because a log is incomplete. Insurance can settle quietly because the event is framed as operational, not criminal, and the file arrives already trimmed. That's the system insight, and it's procedural enough to survive daylight. The easiest way to control labor is to control the definition of available. Availability is not a mood. It's a status field, a code, a lever hidden inside forms that look fair from far away. When discretion sits at the gate, power doesn't need to threaten. It only needs to click a box and let the calendar do the rest. Now, the arithmetic stops looking like a single theft and starts looking like architecture. Small deductions that feel normal. A consulting payment that buys category management. Administrative fees that reward silence. The system doesn't always steal to profit. Sometimes it pays to keep the story inside a box it can close. You keep your conclusions constrained because the record still refuses to give you a full face. The form shows a mechanism, not intent, and mechanisms can be abused or merely endured. So you hold the plausible interpretations in your hand like keys you don't fully trust. Maybe NR was honest, a missed call, a bad line, a check-in not logged, and the bureaucracy simply failed to correct itself before damage calcified. Maybe it was selective, a procedural bruise used when someone became inconvenient. Ask too many questions, file the wrong grievance at the wrong time. And suddenly, the phone didn't connect. The status flips. The good calls dry up. Or maybe it's structural. The designation doesn't need to be false. It only needs to be easy to apply and hard to challenge. In that world, the silent rule isn't a conspiracy. It's an incentive system that trains everyone to behave as if the lever will be pulled. You look back at the redacted incident narrative, the black rectangles guarding their own secret. You picture the blank line in the gate log, the grievance without a signature, the ledgers missing a stretch. Each gap is defensible, alone. Together, they form an outline that feels deliberate, even if you can't prove whose hand shaped it. You place the status change form on top of the stack, because it belongs there, not as the loudest evidence, but as the cleanest switch. Outside, the harbor will look normal by morning. That's what harbors do. They keep moving. They keep feeding the world. They keep their hands busy so their conscience doesn't have to be. You close the folder slowly and listen to paper settle. Files don't die. They hibernate. They wait for someone new to inherit the same incentives, the same discretion, the same convenient gaps. This dossier resolves what can be resolved without lying. The silent rule is policy-shaped habit. Stay eligible. Stay quiet. Stay employed. The cold case stays cold because the system is designed to convert human stories into administrative outcomes, then stamp them closed. And still, something remains in the dark on purpose. The name behind the repeating initials. The missing middle of the incident narrative. The worker who tried to keep copies and then just stopped. Those things remain redacted not only by ink, but by the costs attached to speaking. You switch off the lamp for a beat, just to feel the room without its spotlight. Then you switch it back on. Because the only real antidote to a system built on quiet is attention that doesn't get tired.